Welcome to Gender Rights in the Time of the Pandemic. The Radcliffe Institute at Harvard University is situated on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Massachusetts people. Harvard exists alongside the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag nations. As the Harvard Native American Studies program has documented, quote, located near the Charles River, this place has long served as a site of meeting, exchange, and diplomacy among nations, with thousands of contemporary Native American people living in the greater Boston area and tens of thousands in the state of Massachusetts. We acknowledge the survival and life of these Native American communities on whose land we gather today. As we begin, I want to take a moment to thank the Perrin Moorhead Grayson and Bruns Grayson Dean Leadership Fund for Academic Ventures, which is supporting this event. Their generosity, as well as that of the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and our annual donors, keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. I also want to thank the Radcliffe Institute for creating the essential space to have urgent and sometimes difficult conversations across disciplines, including Dean Tomiko Brown-Nagin for supporting this program, and Becky Wasserman and Jessica Vickland, and the labor of so many people who have made these events happen. It is my privilege to moderate this conversation today on gender rights in the time of pandemic. In putting together these events, we saw the critical need to return to questions of gender and global rights today, to create a conversation about how we survive the stifling immobility that defines our present. This session considers what it means to think and organize for gender rights in global context in the 21st century. A year ago, there was to be a collective gathering on the same themes in person, in a room together, to think about what solidarity might look like for gender and sexual rights in the 21st century. A conversation that was to have activists, artists, intellectuals, musicians, and that was to reach across geographies, in particular to think with people of color in the US and those people located and doing advocacy in the global South. The pandemic has made this conversation all the more urgent. As we thought of the conversation today, now, amidst the pandemic, we felt that there was a need for such conversations to document the impossible lives that women face during the pandemic, a crisis of labor, of the unequal work that working class women, queer and trans people and minorities have had to do in care professions, as caregivers, as essential workers. A generation who faces the impossibility of endless work at home, in wage positions, in professions. We see the urgency of this conversation in this time of racial reckoning, of alarming acts of anti-Black racism, of xenophobia and white supremacy, and in renewed political movements that reveal the dangers of police violence, state militarism at borders, and the denial of citizenship to minoritized peoples by increasingly authoritarian regimes around the world. These movements have been led largely by women, queer, and trans people. Protests, it seems, are at an indefinite crescendo, growing in a world punctuated by pandemic death, perpetual war, and environmental degradation. The question of gender rights in the pandemic has become all the more acute as people encounter new threats to queer and trans rights and bodily autonomy, most recently in Ghana, in alarming new waves of attacks on LGBT peoples, in India, with rising protests during and before and now today, led by women, sexual minorities, fighting for the basic tenets for the right to live, to grow food and control the means of production, to a complex vision of citizenship against religious majoritarianism and state violence. Or here in the US, where in 28 states, trans life, trans childhood has become a flashpoint during the pandemic for a dangerous politics of erasure. These conversations are all the more necessary, and I thank the Radcliffe for giving us the venue to think about the issue of gender rights and really life itself in this time of unending uncertainty and loss. As today's panelist, Professor Lyn Ossome, said in 2019 in an interview about African feminisms, quote, there is something very empowering about stepping into the proverbial room full of feminists who have literally, and sometimes with very little at their disposal, change the course of history, and knowing that all that one has to do was acknowledge those earlier struggles as we learn from them, and then renew them based on present challenges. We have the opportunity then today to think with a set of people who are themselves changing the course of history and renewing visions, feminist and queer visions today. How do we critically imagine world making in this time of outrage, of protest and pandemic? What does solidarity look like on issues of gender and sexuality in the 21st century in the time of pandemic? Today's session features three extraordinary activists, practitioners, and scholars. First, we have Nighat Dad, the executive director of the Digital Rights Foundation in Pakistan. She is an accomplished lawyer, a human rights activist, and a leading feminist voice in Pakistan today. Dad has received widespread recognition for her amazing work, named the Next Generation Leader by Time magazine in 2015, a recipient of the Dutch Human Rights Tulip Award in 2016, and nominated to be a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum in 2018. Dr. Lyn Ossome is Senior Research Specialist and Feminist Economics Lead at the Institute for Economic Justice in Johannesburg, South Africa. A feminist theorist and scholar of political economy, Ossome's intellectual and advocacy work reaches across issues of gender, labor, and violence. Ossome is the author of Gender, Ethnicity, and Violence in Kenya's Transition to Democracy, States of Violence. Dr. Jules Gill-Peterson is Associate Professor of English and Gender, Women's, and Sexuality Studies at the University of Pittsburgh. Gill-Peterson is the author of Histories of the Transgender Child, which shatters the widespread myth, alive very much right now, that transgender children are brand new, a new crisis, suddenly appearing as a changed generation in the 21st century. Just this week, Professor Gill-Peterson's research has been featured across venues, including NPR, and she has an op-ed in the New York Times on April 5th, 2021, Transgender Childhood is Not a Trend. Thank you all for joining us for this conversation. Just some logistics. We encourage those who are watching on Zoom to use the Q&A feature featured at the bottom of your screen to submit questions at any time during the program, and we will try to address as many as we can. Since we anticipate a lot of questions, we ask that you keep your questions short. This will increase the likelihood that we can address as many as possible. It is now my pleasure to pass the virtual floor to Nighat Dad.
Thank you so much, first of all, for having me here and enabling me to talk about the issues that matters to us, especially the women in my country. Most of us who are attending this session, the panelists and attendees know that violence against women is a global issue. But with the advent of technology, this violence has taken new forms. Online harassment is a problem that has permeated the online experience of women, and this is something that has been exacerbated by the global pandemic. As I have said, that online harassment or violence against women in the online space is a global issue. However, to understand how to counteract it, we need to understand and interact with how it operates differently in different contexts. So for instance, in Pakistan, the patriarchal society dictates and controls the lives of women. As technology and the internet became popular here, society tried to shift the on-ground bounds it places on women to the digital spaces. So the biggest problem that women face is the fact that their bodies and their autonomy are pitted against the honor of their family. So a woman who wants to step out of the house to work or speak her mind or be free in her body is considered to act in a dishonorable way, bringing dishonor not only to her, but her entire family. So this is why mostly women aren't encouraged to participate in public life and, same in the digital spaces. And which means that a woman's access to technology is limited, controlled, and highly surveilled. This environment means that the onus is on women to protect themselves, their bodies, and their honor in the eyes of others. Since society has not stood up for dishonorable women, And that's what we have seen with lots of women who have been labeled as dishonored, who have been very well outspoken against the patriarchal society or the stereotypes in Pakistani society. And this then puts a massive target at the back of women, and therefore creating Pakistan's enormous issue of cyber harassment at the moment. Cyber harassment has increased in Pakistan during the COVID-19 pandemic. I work for an organization, Digital Rights Foundation, which has a cyber harassment helpline where people across the country, especially women, can call in to report cases of harassment and seek assistance and guidance on how to pursue cases and file official cases with the law enforcement. In more severe cases, our helpline staff step in and act on behalf of the victims. The total number of complaints for 2020 marked a 70% increase when compared to cases reported in 2019. Just in the month of July 2020, the helpline saw a little under 700 calls. And most of these cases had to do with non-consensual use of images, which usually tech giants call NCUI, where a perpetrator has pictures of women and uses them to blackmail women or ask them to bribe them under the threat of leaking the photos online or showing them to her family. And I have mentioned the concept of honor, how it is attached to the women bodies here. So these photos do not necessarily have to be explicit or intimate, but just the fact that such an incident can occur can mean that women face heavy consequences. This puts women in a difficult position since their freedoms are hanging on such a thin thread. Faced with restrictions on ground and online, women in Pakistan finally had enough and thus began this past decade's women movement, especially young feminist women. Online spaces gave women the space to tell their stories and speak back up. In some cases, women spoke with their name and identity. In others, women spoke up anonymously. With the Me Too movement and with the Women's March, which we call Aurat March in Pakistan, every year we see on the 8th March, women across Pakistan come together and march for their rights. This march faces its largest backlash online and on social media every year after the march. And the most heinous acts are done against the march online. People who are anti-march, they doctor images to prove their point that the march is vulgar and immoral. A lot of people on the extreme right claim that the march is a Western activity and is part of the Western propaganda to destabilize an Islamic country. So in dangerous situations, women are supposedly identified online and they are horrendously doxxed, putting their lives in danger. This year's march, the 2021, during pandemic, women decided not to stop and came out on roads and marched for their rights. And this year march was attacked on a level that most people did not expect and were frankly not prepared for, simply because marchers didn't think that this was in the realm of possibilities. The doctored videos and images made the anti-march entities act up, and calls were made of charging all the people in that particular march with blasphemy, which directly means that those women's lives were put in extreme danger. Social media companies were slow and in some cases irresponsible in acting against such situation when women marchers and other people reported that content. And they actually let a very dangerous situation get worse for these women who participated in the march or who were supporting the march or marchers. So march organizers released a statement about this, holding the social media and tech giants accountable. The statement read, "The truth is harsh, but bears stating. Social media platforms, monopolized by tech giants, perched upon Silicon Valley, are far from being safe spaces for women, particularly those from the global south. They contribute to active harm towards vulnerable bodies. Social media platforms has usurped decision-making power to adjudicate on what constitute dangerous and hate speech on their platforms, making life-changing decisions without any accountability or transparency. These are not abstract debates for us. These are the difference between life and death, backlash in the form of societal violence and violence at home. It is the difference between using these platforms to speak truth to power or deactivating your account and receding into silence." So social media and tech giants need to re-evaluate their relationship with the non-English speaking world. And they need to evaluate how their technology is being used here in non-English and native languages. These companies are unable to control and remove narratives of hate from their platforms, and yet they pretend that their systems can protect the system interest of those in the global south. Overarching policies are bound to exclude and undermine the narratives of certain stakeholders, especially marginalized bodies. When you take that concept and apply it to the billions of people who use the internet and social media, the scale of people being left is massive. Technology and AI and machine learning are taught by people, and people are part of a broken and unequal system. The question that I want to put out here is, how do you counteract and fight against these systems? Technology can definitely be the answer. However, the people and the boardrooms behind technology are not diverse, inclusive, and fail to include the voices of people whom technology can and does act against. It is now my pleasure to pass the virtual floor to Dr. Lyn Ossome.
Uh, Thank you very much, Nighat, and thanks for this invitation. What I'd like to speak about is it's an issue that has preoccupied a lot of my work, which is especially in this pandemic time, which is the gendered nature of care labor and what it means in this, what it means for gender rights in this time of the pandemic. So we know that, the one is to say the pandemic has exposed, very starkly the economies of unpaid and unrecognized reproductive labor that sustains the workforce and sustains millions of families and households amidst the austerity and material dispossession that we're seeing at this time. But it has also, I think, importantly exposed not just the gross inadequacy of the pre-existing welfare or welfarist regimes, but also the fact that, and I think this is an important point, the fact that even those existing public provisioning structures actually are structured around or presume a care economy, which then the state can continue to ignore because it's subsumed within it. So, on the continent, and this is, unprecedented in many countries. We have seen, an interventionist state in many ways. We've seen direct interventions at the level of the household, the provisioning of social grants, temporary employment relief schemes, direct cash and food transfers to households. We have seen the partial opening up of certain food supplying sectors, which has really tried to open up the links between the rural and the urban economy, but mainly around food for subsistence. While these kind of direct interventions that we have seen at the level of the household might not, historically we've seen such moves, but I think what is important at this moment is the sheer global scale of the social and economic crisis, and the fact that it presents a unique opportunity to deal concretely with the crisis, what we call the crisis of social reproduction, which is deeply embedded within capitalism. And at this point, I think it's not yet clear whether what we are seeing is a fundamental restructuring of labor, in the sense that, are we seeing a structural break with the old? Are we seeing a long-term transition? Or what we are seeing are only temporary shifts to accommodate the loss of income and the loss of livelihoods? But what is clear is that this social reproductive crisis that has been precipitated by the pandemic bears very specific consequences or some specific consequences for gender rights, which we can already start to consider. So, on the question of rights, traditionally, when we think of, we might think of workers' rights as functioning through a regime of recognition and redistribution, which traditionally flows between the state, unions, capital. And the point to note here is the visibility which representation demands and accords to labor. But the pandemic ruptures this nexus in important ways. And we can then think of gender rights through this rupture. One is we have seen an almost near collapse of the wage economy in much of the global South, at least. And this collapse is significant because the state as a political entity, if we think of the state as a political entity, which always requires a constituency from which it draws its legitimacy. So its responses, even the state responses, and that constituency in times when capitalism is working and exploiting and getting as much labor in, a large labor force, then that constituency can comfortably be the wage laborers. But how do we think of this now with this collapse that we have seen with the wage economy? So in a sense, the responses of the state through these grants and cash transfers may in fact be read as an avenue, one, for the retention of legitimacy. And importantly, for feminist economists, I think it constitutes a tacit recognition of the extent to which the reproductive domain is sustaining the populace in lieu of wages. But to me, I think there's also a historical question being posed here. The current situation reflects the kind of accommodation that the state and capital has always sought from women. And we can circle this back to the colonial modern state. What this moment, I think the important historical break in this COVID moment is the way the way in which it is happening now. And that is that we are straddled by both, on the one side, there is the possibility which democratization holds for rights. This is a political question, and we might see protests in this sense as making a political demand, the broad recognition. And at the same time, we are also faced with, because we haven't exited the neoliberal space, which has really at its core has been working very hard at the depoliticization of rights. And this is underwritten by neoliberal capitalism. And this is an economic question. So we are sitting with both of this right now. And protest in this moment can therefore be understood as the primary means through which to articulate a condition that is both, at least for women and those who are facing this burden, this reproductive burden. Protest can be understood as a means through which to articulate a condition that is both a political critique of gender oppression and also a structural critique of capitalism. And furthermore, in the context of the pandemic, where we've seen the massive expulsion of the labor force and the shifting, and this is interesting, we are seeing a shifting of some power to women due to the prominence or to the gendered economy, because I think we have to think of gendered labor. It's not just women. It's there's the process of gendering, which I tend to think of more broadly as articulated also to identity, other identities. So, but we are seeing this shift of power due to the prominence of the household and its economies of care, which means that we also at the same time have to deal with the constant threat of gendered violence that accompanies this shift. But violence here is not necessarily only in relation to gender, because we are also actually might be dealing with a reconstitution of gendered solidarities. And this is something that we see historically when, during this, times of such crisis is, I don't know how long I have, we see, solidarity may be rearticulated in relation to class, in relation to ethnicity, in relation to race, amidst the scramble to survive. So it is necessary in this regard to also consider the ways in which violence tends to structure claims to the state as demands, and the claimants of those demands as illegitimate. In other words, the tendency of the liberal state to read the articulation between rights and violence as excessive. Part of an emerging theorization, a more radical theorization of rights, has been to think through this relationship between democracy itself and violence, liberal democracy and violence. So we might think of this rights and violence as excessive, and to see protest as a feminist response to this charge of the excess. And this is a pattern, again, that we see historically, the ways in which the language of protest has structured feminist power and feminist claims to the colonial and democratizing state. So it seems that what are considered as excess are in fact right claims that exceed political rights. So just to end, this pandemic for me raises two important questions. First is, if what we are seeing is a reconstitution of rights around questions of care and social reproduction, we also have to think about what it means to flag, what does it mean for feminists to flag this reproductive domain, this domain of gendered labor as a domain of rights claims? What kind of subjectivity are we holding out to the state to recognize? And second, what does it mean for the domain of care to enter into the regulatory liberal rights regime of the state and of capital? Does the former, the recognition by the state, does it invite greater policing and violence, and with capital exploitation? And is this even desirable? And lastly, I'm sure my time is almost up now, but third, given the historical invisibilization of reproductive labor and care work, and even its outright disavowal, how might we mobilize protest as an avenue for recognition and redistribution in the absence of the legal codification which rights claims depend on this kind of codification? But here we are dealing with a domain that has entered very much into our consciousness during this time, but has historically been disavowed. And just lastly to say that I think this is broadly also a comment on the limitations of rights themselves at a historical moment when human rights have been unable to save us from the social and economic fallout from the pandemic. So it is now my pleasure to pass the virtual floor to Professor Jules Gill-Peterson. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Lyn, and it's my honor to be in conversation with you and Nighat today. And what I have to say in bringing trans rights or trans life into this conversation actually really flows from what both of you have so beautifully outlined. I want to pose a question today about how trans rights have become a kind of ethno-nationalist authoritarian wedge issue or scapegoat issue globally. And think a little bit about what that might mean about what sorts of broader political, economic transformations hang in the balance of the pandemic that actually find themselves being anchored in trans politics in ways that are not always made explicit for ideological reasons. And so let me just say, I'm an Americanist, but I also want to, sort of add a caveat that I see trans here as somewhat of a misnomer because it's also a Western, sexologically derived term. And I think actually there's a certain US narrative around trans inclusion that follows an identity politics model where, the goal of amelioration is some sort of visibility and inclusion schema, or maybe a sort of limited rights-based schema. And the exportation of that globally is actually part of the obstacle here, I think, to understanding how trans and gender non-conforming people's livelihoods can actually lead to a different political economic analysis of authoritarianism, social reproduction, labor, gender and racial violence, and care, the question of care. So of course, here in the US and also in the United Kingdom, we've seen a real focus on the issue of trans youth and trans children, kind of moral panic that spans the left and the right. So you see trans exclusionary feminists and progressive groups allying with hard right politicians who are proposing bills in the United States to criminalize healthcare and participation in education, or in the United Kingdom, a real kind of corporate media-driven libel campaign in the media that has resulted in essentially the literal impossibility of accessing gender-affirming care under the National Health Service for adults, and a really atrocious decision that's only been partially rescinded by a UK High Court that more or less made it impossible for trans youth to access care. But there's a sort of broader kind of global set of tentacles. I want to very briefly mention a couple of them. I think in the United States, I think we'll see a certain theme here. In the United States, a lot of these bills are obviously political distractions from abject failure of governance to deal with public health in the pandemic. So it's a distraction from mass death. It's also a justification for a neoliberal withdrawal of the state from public health and welfare by pinning it on a scapegoat population rather than acknowledging its widespread effects, that will disproportionately affect working class people and women very broadly. And so, this sort of US, United Kingdom-based moral panic model that's largely driven by trans exclusionary feminists and evangelical Christians, right-wing Christian groups and Catholic groups, actually has transnational links primarily into Latin America, where we see a lot of those Christian groups funding and encouraging right-wing politicians to make anti-trans political platforms part of their strategy. But we've also seen, real difficulties in different countries in relation to pandemic measures. For example, in Panama, the use of gender as a criterion for, which day certain people are allowed to leave the house, go shopping, et cetera, has led to a lot of reports of hypervisibility, police abuse, and actually attacks on trans people. There have been dozens of cases documented by activists in Colombia and Peru, for example. And then, switching view for a moment to Eastern Europe, we've seen the really, really kind of violent use of trans people and LGBT rights as scapegoats for, sort of fascist political claims to power, particularly in Poland and Hungary, right? And so, in Poland, we've seen these sorts of localities trying to declare themselves LGBT-free zones where there are no lesbian, gay, or transgender people. And this is a kind of state policy that obviously is inviting extreme violence. It's sort of encouraging extrajudicial but sort of sanctioned violence, which has led to a lot of outcry and investigation within the European Union. And of course, as the lockdown global lockdowns took force last spring, Hungary's parliament introduced a really draconian ban on trans and intersex people's legal avenues to legal recognition, and sort of forced them into situations where their identity documents make them extremely vulnerable to violence. And the country's constitutional court has ruled part of it illegal recently, but we still see these sort of fascist and anti-democracy politicians using trans people as sort of their vehicle to author their sort of style of repressive governance. And then I'll mention also Brazil, of course, where an anti-travesti and anti-Black logics of the Bolsonaro regime obviously are part of a sort of way to justify a total absence of response to the pandemic, with just soaring infection rates and a mass of preventable deaths, which of course hit low-income travesti and Black communities harder as well. And then we could even also, I think, look to India, where, despite the legal enshrinement of a third gender category, material inequities have only been amplified during the pandemic, especially in the broader right-wing Hindu nationalist context of federal level politics. There's been a lot of reporting on the ways that because many hijras live and work outside of the formal economy, they're disproportionately affected by, not reached by government aid. There's also a case in Hyderabad of posters being put up around town blaming hijras for the pandemic. And so I think what I want to point to is that there's sort of a global ascendancy of a kind of authoritarian ethno-nationalist in a variety of contexts. It's not just US-based white supremacy, it's a variety of ethno-nationalists and sort of, in some cases, explicitly fascist politics that take trans people as their scapegoat. And what I think that kind of cues us into is not so much that that trans rights are some sort of identity politics niche issue for one minority community, but actually entangle much broader questions about democratic norms, the state's investment in public health care and education, right? And sort of whether kinds of eugenic and extermination style policies and the sanction of extrajudicial violence will be part of the radical neoliberal sort of reorganization of social economies, and whether the informality of the social reproduction and social labor that many trans people, especially trans feminine people, do in informal economies all over the globe, whether or not that will actually be further marginalized and become a target of violence to prop up different political platforms. And I think that we can talk more about this maybe in our discussion. I think that's actually the place where I would want to call for us to think about what gendered solidarity, racial solidarity, class solidarity looks like, and what protest would mean if it's not sort of selling itself out in advance to a kind of narrow representational rights-based framework, but sees trans rights as integral to, to advancing working class interests, addressing forms of racial violence, addressing police violence and carceral logic, state militarization, and a variety of other issues that are actually pretty consistent across the different global contexts that I mentioned, even though each context is not necessarily the same as the other, and there are an incredible range of differences. And the word trans itself, just to sort of remind and punctuate, is not necessarily the best descriptor always, but I think it's an opportunity to think more complexly about what solidarity also between the global North and global South might look like, between trans people of color, say in the United States and in the UK, and trans and gender nonconforming people in the global South in various contexts. So there's lots more I can say, but right now I'll be happy to turn the floor back over to Professor Durvamitra to get us started in our conversation.
Well, thank you all so much for these remarks. And it just gives us a sense of how much is to, there's to say right now about thinking about whatever this language is of gender rights during pandemic. And I think you all touched on such essential questions, whether it's care labor, the question of what is the responsibility of a social media company, of protection? What is our civic responsibility? And I think Professor Ossome really highlighted this question. How are we carving out the space of civic participation and responsibility in this moment now? And so I think the first question I would ask is, building on what Professor Ossome said about the question of protest as a space, a unique space for defining civic protest. I wondered if you, Nighat and Jules, would be willing to talk about what you see the role of protest to be in the last year or so. And Nighat, if you might start us off.
Sure. So I see in most of the democratic jurisdictions, the constitutions give this fundamental right of freedom of association and assembly, and that's the same case in Pakistan as well. But some jurisdictions and countries are way behind that the Western, countries or developed democracies, where the offline rights also translates into online rights, and we are still, struggling with that space where the jurisprudence hasn't been developed, where the civil liberties enshrined in the Constitution can also be translated in the same way for online spaces. But in last 1 year, we have witnessed that how and why internet and technology became such an important space, where before COVID, my work mostly used to address the fundamental right of freedom of expression in the online space, or access to information in the online space, or right to privacy. But in last 1 year, we have seen how the right to freedom of association and assembly is so important when it comes to internet and technology, and how marginalized bodies, vulnerable communities, minorities, women, they are reclaiming this space and reclaiming this civil liberty, and telling, the stakeholders or the powerful actors like judiciary or government and state that how they can translate this offline right that usually people, like even when our judiciary sort of interpret such rights, they interpret for the online spaces. So I see this space a very important space, and the right to protest and the right to assembly and association has become a very important right. At the same time, when I was speaking about, the Aurat March and Women's March, a lot of movement, not just in the last 1 year, started from online spaces, and women gathered, like strength and power and sisterhood and solidarity, while, creating these small little spaces on internet, and gathered the courage that these spaces, these voices can also be translated into the offline action. So the Women's March started in 2018, and last year we, like a lot of women thought that they won't be able to, come on road due to COVID, but they did. And I think, society wasn't expecting that. That's why we see a huge and massive backlash, which is actually a very, very dangerous at the moment for the marchers, for the organizers, people who are supporting march and didn't, participate in the march. So I feel that, the right to protest, not just in the online or offline space, but in the online space, has become very vital and very important for different stakeholders, that how they are interpreting these online rights and civil liberties, especially, governments and the judiciaries and the judges in the global south, because we are way behind, in interpreting and developing a good jurisprudence when it comes to civil liberties online.
Thank you so much. Professor Gill-Peterson.
Yeah, thanks so much for detailing that. It's I think, a huge concern for trans activists as well, where we've seen just relentless harassment, violence, and threats online, really obviously very clearly trying to push, especially trans women, out of the public sphere and out of social media. So they have no platform in which to articulate themselves, and social media companies hardly, I can speak to that from personal experience, hardly care. But in terms of the vitality and importance of protests more broadly, I'll give two examples and contrast them. I think there is a broader, neoliberal reordering of the public sphere, and even more incredible shrinking of the public sphere going on in a lot of the global north, and certainly in the US. It's striking to me which forms of political action understand that well and which ones don't. So to use one example from last summer, Black Lives Matter protests that were very widespread across the United States, Black Lives Matter makes trans rights and Black trans people's lives very central to its organizing and to its political platform. I think in part because Black Lives Matter understands well that civic life is basically barred for large swaths of the United States population, for African Americans, for trans people, for Black trans people especially, and that police violence and mass incarceration therefore are actually political platforms for trans rights in which there's broad coalitional possibility for protest and dramatic transformation of the relationship of citizens to the state, right? And so it's not really, a kind of faith in state-based narrow civil rights recognition. It's much more radical critique. And I would contrast that with the sort of bourgeois privatized family model that we've seen emerge in response to some of these anti-trans youth bills in the States. So sort of well-off, upper middle-class white parents who are business owners and otherwise extremely respectable appearing in front of state legislators to argue against these horrific bills on the narrowest term possible that essentially boils down to, I don't want the state intruding in my private family because my child is my property, right? And so to me, that is the worst possible way to oppose, what these bills do, which are explicitly eugenic and trying to eradicate trans people as a population. So that to me is a very weak response to the actual material situation in which trans people find themselves. And I would contrast the Black Lives Matter approach to this much more privatized white bourgeois citizenship, liberal state facing model that unfortunately seems to be the dominant one being held up right now.
Thank you. And I think what your comment just points us to is the difficulty of trying to understand a political imaginary around the household. And I think, Professor Ossome, you spoke about this question of the disappearance of labor and the non-compensation, right? The unremunerated labor that happens within the household. We have a question in the chat, in the Q&A that asks a question around this, about proposing an idea about what social reproduction, a politics of social reproduction might look like. Do you see specific political acts of collectivities that anticipate resistance from that space of the household, or how we might think about social reproduction as a site for organizing resistance during the pandemic crisis? So, Professor Ossome.
Yeah, I think one is we have to think, I think this moment compels us to move away, and I think Jules was mentioning this, that the kind of narrow mainstream liberal regime through which we think of rights really cannot account for this moment and cannot account for the nature of this crisis. So in one sense, and also as Nighat was saying, there are spaces like the social media and other spaces that have opened up, they open up a space for a more collective discussion, but those spaces are also faced, in my mind, with a more fundamental problem. That if we are thinking of, in the traditional sense of, these moments of crisis that force us into revolutionary or transitional mode, and if we're thinking of who is the revolutionary subject at this time, in a sense, is there, we can no longer think, and what this social reproductive crisis forces us to do is that, or what it shows is that we can no longer think in relation to the traditional, say, worker peasant alliances. That is not what we are doing right now. Right now, we are thinking of working people. And I like the concept of working people because it insists that many households, especially in the global South, can no longer, no household is surviving only on wage labor. Most households are surviving on a combination of wage labor, on a combination of some kind of peasant or subsistence agriculture, on petty commodity producers, on other forms of affective and care work, in households now, we have to think broadly in terms of working people, but still we are sitting with the problem of, how do you organize? It was easy to organize the working classes because we could trace very easily the form and the line of exploitation. With the reproductive labor, feminist economists we haven't even reached a point where we can show actually that the problem is exploitation. in fact, in our own theorization in the agrarian South, we are even moving and saying, no, it's not really an articulation with capital around exploitation. Much of this work is around survival. People are simply doing this work because we need to survive. So it's not an easy question, but there's an opportunity to really think collectively and to think of all the kinds of care and reproductive labor that is going into sustaining families and households at this time. And so that is, it's still where we need to reach before we go beyond, there's a possibility there. I don't know what it looks like in terms of its transformative potential.
So this idea of working people as a collectivity, right, with working being the most democratized imagination of who gets to claim the position of being a person who's working. We see this right now in renewed energies for wages for housework, for example, in India. What does it mean to compensate people for work that has never been recognized as work, which I think is a critical question. I wonder if I might pose that question back to you all, to you, Jules, and to Nighat, about what do you think is a vision for collectivity right now, sitting from the positions that you are in, and for the collectivities that you think about. Jules.
Yeah, I mean, I think Lyn, you just gave such an elegant, rendition of this question, and for me, as a scholar of trans politics and trans history, this is the turn I'm trying to think about too. Solidarity doesn't necessarily need, if it's not to work on a kind of identitarian axis, and I think that's one of the real ways that sort of neoliberal state politics have tried to make use of and incorporate trans difference in order to further its own kind of agendas of immiseration and deprivation. I think there's an opportunity to think, for example, about social reproduction as the axis, right? And, even in the United States, most trans people are in one way or another enmeshed in informal economies, whether it's an informal economy of healthcare, transitioning outside of institutional norms through Black markets and through radical forms of mutual aid that form the fabric of social life for most trans women, for most trans people of color, and the ways in which sex work and other informal kind of service economy labor is the primary mode through which a lot of trans people are able to put together a livelihood, I think actually is an opportunity, right? So I think, sometimes there's some thinking going on in sort of trans Marxist circles about poor trans people as lumpen proletarian kinds of figures. But in any case, I think there's an opportunity here to focus the political agenda not on the single axis of trans. So the thing I found myself saying, even in media interviews about these anti-trans state legislative bills lately, is they're an incredible distraction from the material reality that faces trans youth. It's terrible to ban healthcare, but not even very many of those children have access to healthcare. So it's sort of a strange kind of cruel red herring. And in reality, issues that affect plenty of non-trans people too, right? Issues of healthcare justice, racial justice, police and incarceration, immigration, housing, and wage and wealth inequality. Those are the primary, a $15 minimum wage or a $20 minimum wage would actually be, have a much more dramatic impact on trans people's lives than formal equality in, the healthcare sector. Although that might be important, I think this is an opportunity to also turn the tables on the authoritarian, ethno-nationalist, neoliberal political agenda, which has so deeply set the tone for this pandemic, right? It has justified death on a mass scale, which unlike what most people have ever even witnessed, right? And yet that has been so easily metabolized by a lot of the population. And we see, again, that it's women, people of color, queer people, trans people. Those are the activists sounding the alarm and who have the broad view of how these things are interconnected. So I think we do actually have an opportunity. I'm interested in, sort of like, what is it that we can come out of this pandemic with that's a much more radical vision for life than what we came into it with, feeling like we were sort of trapped in, right? The privatization of the entire public world doesn't work, right? It just entirely falls on reproductive labor to sustain people. And so that's just an extremely volatile situation that also represents a huge opportunity to re-articulate, I think, the norms of political demands in a coalitional, intersectional, broadly sort of solidarity modality that would be pro-democracy, anti-capitalist, and very critical of Western human rights frameworks as or corporate solutions in the case of social media, right? I mean, obviously, corporate reform and social media companies are not being held accountable in even the smallest ways possible. But this is an opportunity to think of a radical revisioning. If the public sphere is as much Twitter as it is the streets, then we can apply similar understandings from the position of marginalized people to make claims that no, it's not, last thing I'll say on this, one of the things I've been most frustrated in as a public intellectual, as a trans woman on the internet, is that whenever I'm harassed, threatened, pushed offline for a few days, the prevailing sort of, I think, expectation is that you just turn the other cheek, don't say anything. You don't want to instigate any further. And I understand that from a harm reduction model, but it makes me so angry that, it is not just the internet, right? This is a primary platform that I am using to spread my work and to also just be online. And it's absolutely not acceptable to me that this is sort of dismissed as less public or less real. I think we need to sort of retune our imaginary and our demands to help stretch them to meet the reality of the lives that many of us are living in and the organizing work that we're already doing.
And I think that speaks to such a critical issue, right? Which is that those people who are being targeted with violence, those marginalized peoples, people of color, trans people, people working on women's rights or doing women's marches, it's our job to silence ourselves rather than to think about the systemic structural issues that are leading to massive misinformation, right? And this goes back to what I think Nighat has essentially said about the problem of social media companies as the new site of a new form of civic participation. And I wonder if I could just ask the last question then, since you mentioned this, Jules, which I think is really essential, which is to both you, Nighat, and to Lyn. What does solidarity look like for you, for those of us who are in the global north, but also just thinking about what solidarity can be in this moment? What do you see solidarity as now? I think we may have lost Nighat, so I will first direct the question to Lyn.
I think we have to, I'll go back to that notion of the working people. We have to first, come back to, what is valued, what is the, who is actually, to move the question of solidarity from a point, a kind of productive or instrumental idea of who can move the world forward, or who can bring the revolution. Or a lot of people are actually have been so disempowered, both politically and economically, that they do not even have the means, let alone the technologies or the resources to kind of effect this, what solidarity that, the way solidarity is understood in activist spaces or in academic spaces, which is always this big kind of, how can we move resources to move this? No, we have to think, we have to carry most of the world. And I think that is what this moment is telling us. And most of the world is, yes, a lot of it is on social media, a lot of it is connected, but a lot of it is not. And so it is, I think, thinking how we make those connections with people who are actually sustaining the world, where capital has abdicated, long abdicated, the state has long stepped aside. But these people, this silent army of reproductive laborers are carrying most of the world. And I think that is where our solidarities have to shift in terms of carrying that mass.
Thank you. Nighat, the question was, what do you think of solidarity? How can we imagine solidarity from your location now?
So I think it's a huge opportunity, as Dr. Jules said, that it's a time to re-articulate your political demands, and that's what I'm seeing at the moment. And sometimes you find opportunities when you are trying to survive, in a space where you are being threatened, where your very, like existence is being threatened. So I'm seeing this opportunity of bridging sort of like connections with the movements, the intergenerational feminists in Pakistan, and how we all can come together and face the backlash at the moment. And I think that's like that's where the solidarity is, and that's where the sisterhood is, and finding more opportunity, not just for the time being, that how we can survive not just in the threats, face the threats in the online space, but also in the offline space. But at the same time, in this momentum, how we can create sisterhood that will go a long way. And sort of, the young feminist movement in Pakistan, which is emerging at the moment, sort of, go a long way, the way the last feminist movement in Pakistan, which started in 1980s. So I think maybe I'm not really articulate enough at the moment, but I guess in this moment of survival, there is a lot of opportunity of solidarity and sisterhood in Pakistan.
Thank you so much. And I just want to thank all of our panelists today. I just want to highlight what you said, Nighat, I think gets exactly at the question. How do we create a durable conception of solidarity? What will go a long way? Around what all of you have highlighted, around the question of survival, of care, of collectivity, of the very means to have the resources to survive. I thank you all so much for your participation today. This concludes our program today. I want to thank our panelists, Nighat Dad, Professor Jules Gill-Peterson, Professor Lyn Ossome, for their immensely generative presentations and perspectives, and our audience for engaging, for your amazing questions. Today's program has been recorded and will be posted on the Radcliffe website in about a week. For information on other upcoming Radcliffe programs online and to see videos of past events, including last night's event with Ocean Vuong, please visit www.radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us, and please take care.